We're actually going back. Back before Monomyth today. Part of what we see is the origin of our series. So going back that far requires me to bring up an iconic couple that, without them, none of Alden would have even been possible. One of them is Matthias, and the other was his lover, Sir John. When Matthias was around 20, he was still staying in Edinburgh with Patrick and Olivia. He would spend the day striding around town with his VO, playing for passerbys and entice them to visit the blacksmith run by Patrick. Using this technique was basically the earliest forms of advertisement, by word of mouth, and Matthias' gift with song, handsome appearance, and fanciful sword skills brought a considerable number of new patrons to Patrick's forge. Enough that, with the return business, even drew attention from the guild and allowed Patrick to become a part of it. Patrick's skill in Matthias' song even drew the attention of some notable Scottish nobles, including several knights. Patrick could make shoes for the knights' horses, tune up their armor, weapons, and shields more than just churning out nails, locks, and wheels. Matthias made friends with many of the knights as well. He had prior military experience, and many of them tried to get him to join their campaigns. One in particular actually succeeded in this, by promising to bring Patrick along. Sir John was a man who, along with being a Scottish knight, was also versed in Norse magic known as satyr. During the Iron Age, Scandinavian people were thought to practice a sort of shamanic magic known as satyr. A satyr is a Norse word that means cord, string, or snare, and satyr magic is mostly concerned with magic that discerns the course of fate, and even change. It's about symbolically weaving new events into being. In Norse, satyr magic is associated primarily with Freya, who is said to have taught the practice to all of the other Aesir, or Norse gods, most importantly Odin, her husband. Satyr saw a decline during the Christianization of Scandinavia between the 8th and 12th centuries. This means that by the 13th century, practicing satyr would have been seen as taboo. Satyr was generally not limited to a particular sex or gender category, however, it was considered a feminine practice in general. Women who practiced satyr were called volur, Seidkunur, or Vizendagona. Men were known as Seidmen and Seidmadir. Many satyr rituals required more than one participant to complete. During the Viking Age, which coincided with the Christianization, men who practiced satyr were seen as ergi, or effeminate, because it was seen as manipulative and ran counter to aspects that were seen as more masculine at the time, basically being forthright and open behavior. I guess all they figured was that women eat hot chip and lie. Even Odin was accused of being unmanly by Loki in the Lokasenna, or the flighting of Loki. Flighting is a Gaelic term that breaks down to a contest consisting of exchange of insults between two parties, often conducted in verse. Which is basically like Loki wrote a diss track for all the Norse gods and they had a rap battle about it. For Odin and Loki, their exchange went like this. Odin: Knowest thou that I gave to those I ought not victory to cowards? Thou was 8 winters on earth below, milked cows a woman, and didst there bear children. Now that, methinks, betokens a base nature. To which Loki responded, But it is said thou wentest, with tottering steps, in Samso, and knocked at houses as a Vala, in the likeness of a fortune-teller. Thou wentest among people. Now that, methinks, betokens a base nature. Odin basically accuses Loki of being a milkmaid and shapeshifting into a woman in order to have children in Midgard. While Loki accuses Odin of either changing into a woman or cross-dressing as a seer, Vala, and going door-to-door as a fortune-teller. Tottering Steps suggests that Odin may have been drunk or just awkward, suggesting he was also very bad at satyr. Matthias, being a bard, would have been very good at flighting, something that he and Sir John bonded over. Sir John brought Matthias and Patrick along with him during one of his campaigns across the British Isles. They traveled to the Isle of Skye, Isle of Man, England, and Ireland. During this time, Matthias learned satyr from Sir John, and the two would regularly practice rituals together, and developed a relationship on that premise. John was older, more experienced, and Matthias loved his generosity and wisdom. He was a man Matthias admired more than anyone, the first time he ever felt an honest attraction to a man of any kind. Matthias and John spent the entire campaign together. They shared everything from meals to a bed, stories, dreams, and hopes. This was, of course, all while Sir John's wife awaited for him back in Edinburgh. Matthias represented a sort of romantic love that stood apart from the traditional courtly marriage. The satyr is also a term that gives us the words sorcerer, and subsequently sorceress. These are terms, however, that were also used as slang for homosexuality around the 13th century during the witch hunts in Germany. Later adaptations of the Bible, most notably the King James Version, listed sorcerers as a type of sinful practice. This is entirely where we get the conflation of homosexuality being an abomination in the Christian Bible, however. It was originally meant to decline the practice of shamanic magic and was seen as a faith in other gods in favor of only worshipping Yahweh. And not to mention that King James did have several other male lovers. In this way, there's a lot of similarities between Sir John and Matthias' eventual wife, Cassandra. Many times, relationships like John and Matthias had a sort of doomed fatalistic end. Because of the taboos set up by the church, their relationship was forbidden to be celebrated in public. There are some countries in 2024 where it's still illegal just to love how you love, which really just seems ridiculous. Well, why does it matter? Procreation? There are billions of people on the planet. And to be perfectly honest, if you think the proclivity to be gay is so pervasive that it would lead to substantial decline of the world population, I don't know, I think that sounds like you're dealing with some strong personal feelings about that. And if you found this video and got this far, I want to ask you a question. What do you actually think the harm is? If we can accept the fact that people are born gay, it has to mean there's no legitimate way to change someone from gay to straight. They could just be bisexual at that point. Matthias, at least, is legitimately bisexual. Sir John may have been gay, but I actually don't know for sure. He did only supposedly have one child with his wife. Aside from that, I actually don't know a whole lot about Sir John. Matthias was very select about who he told and what he told them. I just know that he was an actual Scottish knight, so I tried looking up knights in Scotland at that time that were named John. And I came up with Sir John of Scotland, or John de Balliol. He was born in 1248, and since Matthias was born in the 1260s, the age difference makes sense, since I know Sir John was considerably older. This would mean that when Matthias was 20, Sir John was around 34 to 35. Shortly after Matthias and Cassandra met, and Sir John returned to Scotland, Margaret of Scotland fell ill on a voyage to Scotland and died in Orkney in 1290. This event led to a period known as the Great Cause, because Margaret lacked a clear heir. 13 contenders arose for the claim of the Scotland crown, and among them were the credible claims of Robert Bruce and none other than John Balliol. Scotland was on the verge of civil war, and because of this it was left with no other choice than to call upon King Edward I to arbitrate. And this presented a problem that eventually led Scotland into one of the bloodiest wars it had ever seen. Edward I, also known as Longshanks or the Hammer of the Scots, agreed to the arbitration, but only under the condition that all of the contenders recognized him as Lord Paramount of Scotland. This was done as a ploy by Edward to find a king he could manipulate, and he found that king in John Balliol. The excuse was given that John had the highest claim to the crown, to being senior in genealogical primogeniture, even though he wasn't closest in proximity of blood. What happened next is Edward quickly did everything he could to undermine the authority granted to John over the Scottish people. Using him like a puppet king, Edward started treating Scotland as a feudal vassal state, demanding homage be paid toward himself and military support in his war against France, even summoning John to stand before the English court as a common plaintiff. Unrest in Scotland continued to grow during this time, and many recognized John for the way he was being manipulated. Because of this, the remaining leaders of the country formed the Council of 12, from those who remained and previously argued for their claim to the crown. In just 3 years, the Council of 12 appointed a new panel of guardians at Stirling, and stripped John Balliol of his powers as king. They also went on to form an alliance with Edward's enemies in France, a treaty of mutual aid eventually known as the Auld Alliance. John was... oh my gods! So John Balliol was imprisoned at the Tower of London following his abdication. This actually lines up with the timeline when supposedly Matthias learned that Sir John actually died. He was later sent to France in 1299, which would have been right about the time Madeline and her family got to Alden. And when he got to France, When he got to France, he was stripped of half his finances and remanded to the custody of Pope Boniface VIII on the condition he remained in a papal residence, basically so the church could keep an eye on him. John was later released in 1301 and lived the rest of his life on his family's ancestral estates at Helicourt in Picardy. No wonder. When word was sent to Matthias about Sir John, it was just explained that he died. He may have preferred to think of John, his John, as the kind and generous man he was, which is why he only refers to him as Sir, not King. King John Balliol was seen as an embarrassment, someone that Matthias just didn't want to admit to having any kind of relationship with. Instead, he clung to the old memories before he was king, when he was a brave and chivalrous knight, a kind teacher and lover. When you think about it, it was John that gave Matthias the money he needed to start a venture like Alden, and Alden is a village that stands in defiance of the church and Edward by accepting refugees and those people who would be seen as witches, sorcerers, and other ungodly things. I feel like I uncovered something today. A story that no one in my whole family ever knew existed, and I gotta admit, it's pretty sad. To think that Matthias loved John so much, he built an entire village in honor of a man who was a visage of the man he knew, a man that King John was not. Or could it be that Matthias always knew John Balliol was alive in France? But because of his fall from grace, he preferred to think of the man he loved as dead. I don't know. Why don't you tell me what you think down in the comments? I didn't expect this one to go so heavy. So, let's consider some of the creative aspects of this picture. Figuring that Sir John is actually John Bellow, I based his color scheme on this picture. Done by an unknown artist in the 1600s, it depicts John with his wife Isabel de Warenne. The art itself is part of the National Library in Scotland in Edinburgh. This style of cape is seen being worn by just about every stereotypical king, and is known as a royal mantle, or simply a mantle. Kings, queens, emperors, princes, all wear such a mantle, usually for a ceremony or coronation. The coronation mantle might only be worn once, or it might be worn for several occasions and special ceremonies. His armor is based on a 13th century armor of the time. As elsewhere in Europe, the armor in Scotland consisted of a short, wide-sleeved hauberk reaching to the knees. This had a coif to cover the head, and was slit the front and the back to enable a wearer to still ride their horse with relative ease. Typically, the helmet was conical, made of iron, with a protective nasal piece. Matthias' outfit, being as it is, would have been something decidedly more fancy than he was used to wearing, probably as a gift from John. I debated for a bit as to how to color it exactly. The dark red of his adult outfit seemed a little too dark for a light and airy bard, so I really just took the color that he wears under his tunic as an adult and made it the overall color for his younger attire. However, I also left a hint of the deep red underneath his doublet to draw in the character's original color scheme. Light colors, even this style of peachy orange, are great for people with an air element because the brightness enhances the feeling of freedom. The dance they're doing is a variant on the most common form of dance at the time, a carol. It's described very sufficiently in The Carol, a study of medieval dance by Dr. Robert Mulley. In his book, Mulley focuses on the details relevant to history, choreography, and performance of the dance, as stated in primary sources. Using this methodology, he's been able to refine what we know of the carol and describes it as follows. The carol was a principal social dance in France and England from 1100 to 1400 and was frequently mentioned in French and English medieval literature. However, it has been widely misunderstood by contributors in recent citations in dictionaries and reference books, both linguistic and musical. The carol was performed by all classes of society, kings and nobles, shepherds and servant girls. It is described as taking place both indoors and outdoors. Its central position in the life of its people is underlined by references not only in what we call fictional texts, but also in historical or quasi-historical writings, in moral treatises, and even in a work on astronomy. For John and Matthias in this picture, their carol may have had some connotations, such as using the stars to divine a bright future together. So, it's very poetic. This style of pose with these specific characters, John and Matthias' love was star-crossed after all, something that came in hot like a comet, but then vanished quickly in the night. You'll also notice this younger version of Matthias doesn't have his characteristic horseshoe mustache. Part of this is because he's younger here, but still, he is over 20. I used to think maybe he grew out his mustache like that because of the facial hair Sir John wore. Sir John seemed to have a version of the Verdi beard. This name comes from Giuseppe Verdi, a 19th century Italian composer who's best known for his operas. If you don't recognize him by name alone, you might recognize him by one of his three most famous operas, Requiem in 1874, Othello in 1877, and Falstaff in 1893. Given that Verdi lived a full 600 years after Sir John and Matthias, it's highly unlikely his style is based on him. Probably just a coincidence. Do you guys want to know what my favorite opera is? Yes, I actually do have a favorite opera. It's called Gianni Schicchi, a comic opera in one act by Giacomo Puccini. Believe it or not, it's actually mentioned briefly in the Divine Comedy. Oh, my dad can't stand Dante Alighieri. So in the Divine Comedy, Dante visits the circle of impersonators and sees a man being attacked by another. He's told by Virgil that this is Gianni Schicchi, who was condemned for impersonating Busso Donati and making the old man's will highly favorable to Schicchi. Now, I know what you're thinking, that really does sound like a jerk move, but wait! That's what makes the plot of the opera so fascinating. While Gianni Schicchi does impersonate Donati, it's because Donati's family discovers he's passed away, go through his will, and find that they've been left with nothing. The oldest among them, Simone, hires Schicchi to trick the notary into changing the will, and Schicchi agrees. The entire time the notary is present, Skiki helps rewrite Donati's will and leaves everything to himself. The whole time this is happening, the family could do nothing to stop him because they'd all be arrested and exiled for committing fraud, and Skiki sneakily reminds them of this as they fume. The youngest of the family is a young couple who's not at all involved in the scheme. Removed from the situation, this makes them a relatively innocent party in everything going on. Johnny Skiki chases the rest of the family out of what is now his house and gifts a considerable dowry to the couple, who are now free to get married. Skiki then asks the audience to forgive him in light of extenuating circumstances. I love the intrigue and the comical way it's presented. You can find some performances of Skiki right here on YouTube, so if you're interested, look it up. I highly recommend it. You know, using the information I have on John, I've been trying to figure out what his element might have been. I don't want to go by what color his mantle is, because that's really just the style that they were. He wears yellow otherwise, so he could have been another heir like Matthias. That would make sense. I think another would probably be Void, as it would explain his skill with Satyr. Void element usually deals with things like fate and change. Well, that's all I have for you this week. A Pride Month special about a truly endearing couple with a tragic revelation. It just doesn't get any more Tales of Atonement than that. Art for this week is by Laura S. on Fiverr. She's a multi-talented artist and designer with several years of experience in fine art and graphic design. Her art pieces have been featured in exhibitions, publications, and galleries all across the United States, and we're pleased to have worked with her on this piece. The way she helped us realize John as well as young Matthias really helped in revealing a long-hidden truth about one of the most mysterious parts of my family. And I can't help but think that Sir John is giving a lot of Pierce Brosnan, whereas Matthias reminds me of a young Gerard Butler. I'll be putting a link down in the description so you can commission Laura personally. Art for this channel wouldn't even be possible, however, without the help of our patrons. Monetization on YouTube is not enough to keep us going, so please follow the Patreon link down in the description to help Tales of Atonement keep going long term. We have a lot left to do and a big story to tell, and we simply can't do it without your help. Besides, there's a ton of extras only available on Patreon that won't be available for months on YouTube, if ever. Some of our great patrons include Pammy Poo, Shadow Fox, Arya Gamari, Charles Tam, Jace Morland, and Lunder Lumen. Thank you all for watching and supporting our story.